I'm going to talk to you today. Well, the title of our talk is the survey of the top Web 2.0 tools for education. A little bit of a bait and switch. I think Web 2.0, cynically speaking, is a bit of a marketing term. It does mean some things to some people. Flippantly, a lot of people will say that it basically, Web 2.0 is all about the people. I think Dan today started telling a story that I like in terms of trying to capture the writable web in terms of its essence. The idea that Web 1.0 was all about, one giant glass wall and a few people had markers on one side of it, and Web 2.0 is all about giving everybody markers on all sides. And so that's kind of the gist of it, but I think in a lot of ways it's a lot more interesting to get into some of the more substantive transformations that I think the current era of the internet has begun to capture, and arguably Web 2.0 was implicit and alluded to in the original specifications and visions and conceptions of the web. So what I'd like to talk about in terms of specifics is a lot more about participation and participatory media and participatory culture and social media, if those things mean things to people, and collaboration. Collaboration is thrown around very often as a platitude. Everyone thinks it's a great thing, but there really are a lot of different ways to collaborate. There's teamwork, there's group work, there's peer production, there's distributed research, and there's various segmentations and forms of interaction that those different kinds of collaboration can take. And so as we sort of dive into some of these tools, that I'm going to give you some examples of, I think you should keep some of these notions in mind in terms of the different ways to kind of run them. Another thing I'd like to start out from is pretty far away. I'd like for us to start outside of education and to be thinking a lot about what's going on in the world at large across a lot of different domains and sectors. And this transition from consumers to producers is something that a lot of people have been talking about and has a lot of implications potentially for impacting the way that teaching happens. And here's a quote from Henry Jenkins. He's a media scholar at MIT. He's working a lot right now on digital literacies, on a MacArthur grant. He writes about the ability to annotate, appropriate, and recirculate. And meanwhile, Apple down the hall is telling us about ripping, mixing, and burning. Constructivists since the 60s in education have been talking about creating, publishing, and sharing as a really important alternative to the banking model of depositing knowledge inside of people's heads. But the parallels here are probably worth considering, and especially because in most of our everyday lives nowadays, whether or not it's looking at the torrents of baby pictures that your nephew and nieces are sending you, or just interacting with members of your local community board, or whatever involvement you're part of nowadays, organizations are beginning to make more and more use of tools that I think it's very easy to imagine once you start focusing on it how they might be applied to an educational or a classroom setting. And so I'd like to kind of start outside of education and then kind of work our way in. Some of what's actually the glue that's making a lot of this possible, a lot of this participation possible, are these networks. And networks connect people and connect ideas and connect things, and the network is really becoming the new medium. And just as organizers needed to learn to embrace the word processor instead of the typewriter, they nowadays need to embrace the network as their organizational medium. And so whether or not you like technology or a Luddite or whatever, like, the network is here, and the ability to work with it is part of what it now means to be a community organizer. And community organizers come in a lot of forms because there's lots of different kinds of communities. Classrooms are communities that are organized by teachers, and nonprofits have to deal with a lot of these issues with their constituents. Governments and their citizens, corporations and their customers, especially if they're trying to do viral marketing, are all looking at very, very similar sets of tools with very similar kinds of features. It might be the case that the way that they're tuning, configuring, or setting up these features varies slightly depending on their objectives, but from an abstract point of view, you'll find that a lot of the tools that are being used across these sectors have an awful lot in common. And there's a lot of advantages to leveraging these tools across domains because some of the problems are shared, whether or not that's internationalization or, there's a lot of things that kind of exist as common problems across all of these different domains. There we go. And when setting up one of these environments, again, from an abstract point of view, I think it's important to consider the balance of knowledge, communication, and power is one way to think about it. But there are specifics here that I think this translates into, whether or not it's kind of coming to terms with or understanding some of the hierarchical arrangements that are being represented or put forth in the way that the tool is set up, and being a lot more deliberate about which tools you're selecting in order to accomplish certain kinds of things. If you're trying to balance the push and the pull of information out to a particular community, it's an art, not a science, or as much as a science, and it's tough to get right. But if there's something that you have in mind that you're trying to accomplish, it kind of helps a lot to keep these variables or these factors in mind. There's a lot of grassroots groups nowadays that are making do with suites of tools that, especially when taken together in combination, are way more powerful than the sum of their parts. And in many cases, combining a mailing list, a wiki, a blog, and an RSS, for example, is as effective or as powerful as the six-figure intranet or course management system that existed 10 years ago in terms of people's ability to very quickly, flexibly, and efficiently communicate with great agility. And when we're talking about Web 2.0, it's probably really important to consider these age-old communication friends of ours like voice, chat, and plain old email. These forms of communication don't go away. It's very rare for a communication medium to actually go and die. And to the extent that we continue to build on the old stuff, keeping in mind the role that some of these tools play, whether or not it's old-fashioned synchronous phone call, and what happens when you email off the mailing list and things are archived or not, and who gets to see what, and if a new person on the project or in the class can catch up if they missed the first 2 weeks of class during the shopping period. All of those things kind of come back into play, and decomposing your problems into these smaller parts is one way to kind of work towards bringing them back together into something that makes sense for whatever it is that you're trying to do. So that's the general. In terms of education, I think education offers us an incredible opportunity to experiment and learn a lot about these new communication forms. Educational settings are really microcosms of these interactions that I was just describing. You've got a little micro community that, honestly, depending on the longevity of the project you have in mind, might start over each semester. You can try new things. You don't get stuck with the legacy way of thinking or doing things necessarily. There's also some characteristics which, again, are general but are even more important when it comes to education. The privacy concerns are heightened to the extent that these students are very often coming here and learning to be. They're learning to grow and become and experiment with their own identities, and to take some of these students and put them out into the public, into the wider internet, is a consideration and a trade-off that needs to be understood. And today's talk is mostly about mashing up with gratis tools that are provided in the open world. Very often that does mean that the work will be done and conducted outside in the open. There certainly are advantages to operating that way, but it needs to be really thought through and understood. What happens within the walls of the ivory tower is distinct, and there's often a value in generating a certain kind of community within the class. And the trade-off of everything that we lose when someone goes off the Columbia.edu domain in terms of the exposure to certain kinds of advertising, as opposed to missing an opportunity to potentially connect them up with a reserve reading, or potentially connect them up with a related class, or a mentor or a tutor from an earlier, from an older class or alumni. Those are all things that are in play. And again, today I'm not going to give you a prescription as much as try to develop a roadmap. And in many cases, it's going to make a lot of sense to consult with your friendly neighborhood educational technologist and try to talk through some of these issues. And there are plenty of occasions nowadays where it might make a great deal of sense for your class to be involved in correcting, participating, or producing a Wikipedia article on Wikipedia itself, and the value that will accrue with them actually putting themselves out there and developing that voice is often a very valuable thing to happen within someone's educational career. But for them to, providing them with the opportunity for them to develop that confidence and that voice, possibly in a more closed setting, is just part of what's in play. And so those are just some things to think about. In terms of some of the power dynamics, I think education actually provides a really concrete example of how this stuff plays out. Sometimes people, it takes a little bit of convincing to persuade them that software environments nowadays embody ideologies and represent traditional architecture in a lot of ways, but you know, to the extent that you know, these environments are now mediating human-to-human interactions, they're not deterministically fixing how those things are going to play out, but they are catalyzing, facilitating, favoring, and shaping those dynamics in specific ways. And so one way to think about this is like, do you want to create an environment that is modeled on a lecturer, you know, speaking to a classroom, or modeled on a seminar where anybody can speak at a turn? And you know, something like whether or not somebody needs to be called on before they could speak, or if their comments are being moderated, or if they can freely correct or edit anything that the faculty member wrote, say for example inside of a wiki, are all considerations that kind of come into play when people are thinking through the classroom dynamics. And you know, again, there's also the consideration of whether or not you want those kinds of rules to be enforced by the system formally, or whether or not it would be sufficient, you know, for there to be a cultural imperative that everybody in the class does this in a certain way, and everyone agrees that that's how they're going to operate. And that's another consideration when looking at these different bewildering assemblies of software. But the question of how structured the participation will be, how seated or scaffolded the curricular engagements will be, are all things that are important to consider when looking at any technology or any tool really in creating one of these syllabi. This is sort of the obligatory Web 2.0 logo fest, and I don't know, this is probably 2 years old, or who knows if any of these companies still exist. Or, but yes, this is definitely, there's a lot of clutter out there, and one of the reasons I couldn't give you a top 10 list is because I figured it would already change by between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock, and I wasn't able to put it together that quickly. So getting beyond the hype, I think everyone ought to, you know, think through the fact that while a lot of people are endorsing the use of these kinds of tools in their teaching, none of us learn this way, right? So how can any of us be so sure that this is effective? I think, you know, probably not spotlighted today, but there are a couple of examples out there of collaborative works where a lot of people patted themselves on the back and felt really good about, you know, what came out of it. But when you looked at it closely, it might have been a little shallower, say, for example, than some of the deeper critical work that people might have been more proud of 10 years ago. So, okay, you did it all together, but what is the end product there? And so those are you know, some of the critical stances to perpetually kind of bring to the question of what's the end product here in terms, you know, and the process is often important, and it might be the case that, you know, what they're trying to learn is what it's like to work together and how to work together without, you know, emailing a Word document back and forth to each other 15 times. That could be important too, but all of those will be considerations to take into account when you decide whether or not you're going to run this particular session, this particular class exactly the same the next time, or if you're trying to build an archive that will, you know, kind of transcend time and exist, you know, over the years. So they are very interrelated. Again, you know, the way to kind of navigate this is to try to be purposeful about what you're trying to teach. And if you have a clear idea or somewhat clear idea of what you're trying to teach and how you want to get there, then the selection of the tools will, it won't melt away, but it'll be the guiding principle with which you can more deliberatively experiment. So this was a project I saw out at ITP where a student was actually building a little robot to take number 2 pencil multiple choice tests. And so we'd like not to create automaton students, but you know, if all we're going to be doing is teaching to the test, then they might as well be. All right, so this is kind of a schema that I've been developing to help think about or sort through the vast array of capabilities that I do think are emerging, and some of them are new. I do think that technology might very well be changing what's knowable and how we go about knowing, and as a corollary, what's teachable and how we go about learning. And to just divide this up, I mean, I think what I'm trying to do here is to sort of indicate sort of layers that build on each other in terms of some of the capabilities that are really coming together in the past couple of years. And some of the slides I have in this stack are going to be have been reused from 2 years back, and some of that is a testament to the fact that some of the standards that are in place right now are solidifying, and some of this stuff seems to move at a glacial pace, although it's actually a breakneck pace from a certain distance. But let's start out basically with aggregating, filtering, and networking. And what I'm getting at there is I guess the starting point of the writable web, people's ability to kind of make an assertion, to make a point, to put something out there, and then in turn for that information to be connected to other information and to be kind of roped in and pulled in or organized along with others. And we'll get to some examples of all of these soon. After that, and this is really a central problematic, I think, of that the center has been involved in for a long time, is the question of citation, reference, and annotation. And I guess if you consider the past few millennium of scholarly discourse around text, at least, the heart of that engagement has often involved citation, reference, and annotation. And the question of what those operations look like or even mean for multimedia, and what they look like or mean when your primary sources or your primary evidence is visual, audio, or moving video or sound. Right. So those are hard problems. The world needs those solutions badly right now. I think honestly, even when it comes to textual annotations, the web doesn't have a standard solution for that. And again, there's probably a lot of cases out there where that's not central. If you're developing a marketing brochure, maybe you don't need to be citing it, but there's a lot of cases where it is. And we've seen examples, for example, in some of today's wiki presentations where people have made do. They've come up with ways to accomplish functionally a very similar kind of operation. So you put a little link around a phrase and now have the hypertextual ability to sort of functionally annotate it. But I think people see what I'm getting at here in terms of the ability to really operate with these primary materials and sources the way that scholars have for millennium. And then you've got images and audio to boot. The third level here, I think, is a little harder to grasp because I think there really might be something somewhat new here. There's precedents for visualizing, mapping, and synthesizing throughout history. People have synthesized all the great works and tried to put it and condense it into one text. They've also done a lot of work on charting and representing and in that way. But to the extent that what I'm really trying to capture here are things that emerge where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. I think there really are some new things going on, and some of that has to do with the volume of information that we're suddenly contending with and operating on, and some of that has to do with in this network-enabled world, the capacity for little contributions to kind of add up to something much, much, much larger with a whole new layer of meaning. And so we're seeing evidence of that come out in the tremendous excitement being generated around geographic mapping and visualizing data on maps and the ability to make a lot of these visual arguments using maps, the ability to analyze this kind of data visually and the kind of synthesis that's going on, sometimes computationally aided, is also arguably transformative here. So to get into aggregation, filtering, and networking, I'm just going to do a quick run through on RSS so people have some idea of what that is, and then I'm going to go to the demos. So I don't know, just quick show of hands. How many people in the room know what RSS is? Excellent. That's phenomenal. Anyone here actually use a reader and subscribe to feeds? Okay, so I won't spend too long here, but it might be helpful to kind of just go over this for people who aren't really sure what's up with this yet, and to say, okay, to start with, RSS stands for really simple syndication, although I think there might be some other variations that people argue about. It's got a lousy name. I think it's been said that if it had been called speed feed or even podcast, which arguably is an RSS feed, it'd be a lot more popular. It is really popular in a lot of ways. People, especially after this, ought to recognize that little icon or the orange XML sign everywhere nowadays. I mean, most pieces of blogging software, most online newspapers, magazines, just about most websites you can imagine have begun to expose their content over RSS. And beyond just serial content, like the latest news story, there's more and more applications that are exposing data over RSS. So you can get the recent changes out of your wiki in RSS. You can get some combination of links that correspond to a particular tag out of Delicious. So this really is a kind of a standard transport format. And there are other standards involved that are important to think about. But this is really a good place to start. And I guess just what it means is that you've got a page and it presents a lot of stuff to you, and the feed is the machine readable version of that information. And you know, the machine readable version may or may not sound exciting to you, but it's really exciting to programmers, and it's really exciting to other machines, because other machines can now make sense of it without having to, I don't know, sift through all the extraneous pretty stuff. When it's in a machine readable format, it can be pulled into a reader. It can be pulled into pretty much any website with the right, you know, hoops or tricks that you can jump through. It can make it onto phones, etc. And a lot of entrepreneurial and innovative programmers in their spare time or as a part of their business have taken advantage of some of these standards and begun to build services around the data that exists inside of other tools. So 2 years back, we gave this little history where we sort of connected HTML to carving out of stone. And while it's not that old, it kind of has a similar feel in terms of how tough it is to change. You know, we still get calls on occasion from folks who have their website. You know, somebody built it for them in Dreamweaver, and they've left, and there's no easy way to change it. And I imagine a lot of people in this room have struggled with raw HTML, or have had to deal with the fact that someone left them that little gift, and they'll be familiar with that. CourseWorks makes things a little bit easier, at least on the faculty side, in terms of writing. I think it's probably fair to say that the proliferation of course and content management systems is also part of the Web 2.0 phenomenon. And you know, in its extreme, when you look at content management and take into consideration the range of users and include all of the members of a site as contributors, that content management is sort of the heart of Web 2.0. That is the ability for non-technical people to easily organize and update content. So that's all happening. And then things really start to take off, I don't know, I guess around the turn of the millennium, with the proliferation of blogs and wikis and much easier to use and much more affordable content management systems. We've got a little newspaper delivery guy here sending you your syndication so you can read your news in bed along with your breakfast, or just pick it up and read it wherever you happen to be. And even 2 years ago, Dan Beebe, I think, anticipated the proliferation of these services, and maybe we got a little ahead of ourselves at the time, but the idea here was that, you know, we'd be able to take from these services that conform to these formats things like videos, things like the ability to comment, things like the ability to annotate and read, and compose and incorporate them into an existing site, even potentially a legacy site like CourseWorks, though we are on the road towards newer and better content management systems, which we'll also need to fit into this map and worldview of tools. So this is things that we've been talking about for a while, and a lot of them are actually here. I'm going to hop onto the system, and let's see what we've got. No, not that. Okay, so just for the record, there is a site out there nowadays called Programmable Web, which actually tries to track all the different ways that people are mashing different things up here. I'm not going to go through that. Where I want to start today as an example is with this Crowdvine site that we put together for this conference. I'm afraid we might not have gotten the news out early enough for too many people to hop on here, and I don't see too many laptops around or much of a back channel at this conference. But this little site is run by a company that provides hosted conference social networks. So, I mean, everything that you see on this site today ended up on there within the last 2 days. And what's, I think, notable, and what I wanted to spotlight here, is that the bulk of the content that appears on this site, so if we go to my profile and kind of just start cruising down, the things that are showing up on this site aren't really on the site, right? They're kind of being pulled in from these other places where Crowdvine presumes I already have a presence. It presumes that I likely already have a blog, that I likely already am collecting photos and bookmarks somewhere on the web. It doesn't even necessitate that I actually be using a specific tool like Flickr or Facebook or Delicious. It will take any RSS feed and actually allow me to include that link and then display that information alongside. I kind of have, well, I want to try to get through a few more examples, otherwise and then I can work through more of this. But I do want to mention that while Crowdvine kind of guides this experience around this composition of various content. Anything that you see in here, you could also very easily do in wiki spaces, for example. Wiki spaces, you'd have to decide that that's what you wanted to do, but you could very easily set things up so that you were pulling in these feeds in this way. Likewise, Sakai also has robust support for both inbound and outbound syndication. And syndication of feeds is, you know, another maybe jargony way of saying it can do this RSS thing. It can do this, you know, pulling the data in and also exposing it so that other applications in turn can you know, produce and consume the information somewhere in the pipeline. Let's see. So this site, you know, when you start browsing around, it really exists. They set it up. I think it's free for the simple stuff and a little more expensive for if you want more features. But what it's meant to do is allow people who are all attending a conference to identify who it is that they might want to talk to, who it is that they might want to meet, and to keep track of them. And you know, there's the ability to have some conversations here, but the bulk of the content in the site is pulled in from elsewhere. The presumption is that you already have an online presence and you exist, you know, in some other capacity, and that, you know, it would be a huge hassle to get people to work and put new information in here. So, but as it's updated elsewhere, it gets updated here too. Along the lines of aggregating, filtering, and networking information, I wanted to show you pretty quickly a little site that exists for my graduate program. My graduate program, you know, has a site where people are, you know, sharing, you know, some basic calendaring and announcements. But then when you get into the work that a lot of different people are doing, one thing that's pretty interesting is again a very simple idea, just an aggregation of multiple feeds, but done in such a way that nobody has to keep track of who's in and who's out. Essentially, there's a software out there called Planet, which does nothing more than combine a bunch of feeds together. And it's entirely comparable to running within your own newsreader, you know, composing or, you know, collecting together all these feeds. But it does keep them all kind of organized and straight so that you only go to one page and that's everybody's blog, and it all gets interwoven. So, you know, you see the things as they come out in order. Right. So Pipes is a tool that Yahoo supports and puts out that lets you do a lot of simple and also sophisticated things with data that exists out there on the internet. And I'm just going through this stuff really quickly. It's not exactly a demo in that way, just because, but please do follow up with me and I can explain more of these tools to you as well. Another technique that's along the same lines is really just a variation on the sharing of links. But when everybody decides and agrees in advance to share a particular tag, then the compilation and the collection of those tags over time can potentially end up being something significant. So this is a tag that the Teachers College department shares and uses. And I think one of the things to think about, you know, especially in relation to the conversation we had just started, was the difference between, you know, kind of finding something interesting and sending it out and bombarding somebody's inbox with it versus actually just collecting it inside a Delicious. And then, you know, again, you know, Dan had a great comparison to little snowflakes. You know, you got a lot of little snowflakes and then one day you have a snowdrift. You know, a year later you kind of come back and the next thing you know is, you know, you've got a collection and you can see what's related and you can see, you know, how these things all fit together. And you know, and again, this is a practice that some people call distributed research. And at the moment we're still basically at that first tier where we haven't even done much interacting with each other's stuff, although we're starting to kind of pull it all together and synthesize it. So, so those are some examples of aggregating, filtering, and networking. Okay, so I wanted to start talking a bit about citation, reference, and annotation. And again, this has been a central concern, problematic interest of CC&MTL since their inception. But the world is moving along and catching up, or well, moving along at least. So it's definitely worth keeping an eye on. So I wanted to, I mean, whether or not people were aware of this, I wanted to show off, for example, sort of what exists today in Flickr and Facebook as well, and then also kind of describe some of its limitations, right? So whether or not you knew it and why, hold on one second. I'm not logged in, that's why. One moment. I was before I sat down. So this is I don't know if people here knew about or have ever used the note-taking functionality inside of Flickr or Facebook, but it does provide you with a simple ability to kind of, draw a little box and write a little description around it. What isn't there, and what does exist in some of our tools that were spotlighted today, like in MAP and like in like mapping the African American Past project and the Southside Journal project, is the ability then to kind of create a link which goes directly to that little snippet or segment that you had just created. And again, if we're keeping in mind, the discourse around these objects and, this end goal of potentially a multimedia essay where students are kind of linking or citing to a material like they would a bibliographic citation, then that becomes an important feature that we don't have today in Flickr, but is something that the center is actively exploring and has implemented on some of our custom projects. Likewise, what would it mean to cite or reference a video? Recently, YouTube actually introduced annotations on videos. They don't exist for any video in YouTube. It has to be one that you uploaded. You're the only one who can create an annotation on a video, but it is worth knowing that they're tracking this pretty closely. And so these are some videos that I've uploaded, and I did not go into the annotation here. If I click on the annotation side, this is going to start to play. And YouTube is going to give me the ability to jump to an existing annotation of mine. As soon as it loads, right? So I drew that little box, and I can also, if I go a little further, create a new well, anyway, you guys get the idea. So now one thing that YouTube also doesn't do is allow us to create a link that goes just to that little segment. And what I wanted to show you, because it'll likely be the case that it will do that someday soon, is that there's another tool out there called Spliced, which has nothing to do with YouTube. They don't have any contractual arrangement. This all works because the internet is beginning to conform and obey to standards. YouTube now has an API that allows you to clip and annotate, and by going over to Spliced, for example, I can put in, the time codes, and it will, based on the link that I gave it, actually create, a snip and give me a URL that goes just to that video. Would I recommend using this in a class? Probably not. Maybe, maybe not. YouTube might have this functionality within a couple of months. Some of the tools that the center has worked on already have this functionality. We're trying to track this kind of thing closely. I brought this out to illustrate, first of all, the fact that this stuff is coming on strong, to try to get people to think more about along these lines, and also to demonstrate in practice how these different sites are actually able to interact and communicate with each other, without any prior arrangement. So I think that's pretty notable. I wanted to actually show you a research project that I saw presented here at Columbia that's coming out of Yahoo Berkeley Research Labs. And Yahoo, which owns and runs Flickr, has the fun problem of trying to figure out how to present a few from amongst the billions of photos that now exist in their system. And this is one effort, along those lines that artificial intelligence researchers are pursuing. And I'm going to click over here and go to New York City, and click on the Brooklyn Bridge. And what's going on here is might not look that spectacular, but as I explain it, hopefully you'll be dumbfounded. None of the information that shows up on this map was entered or judged or edited by a person. All right, so the designations of the names of these areas and which ones are prominent or important are basically being harvested and culled across all of the pictures that have been geotagged in Flickr. And likewise, the pictures that are representative of those areas are the winners of a similar popularity contest, according to the algorithms that the researchers are working on. The presenter made the interesting point, I think, that in some respects the designation of Tribeca that exists in this system is more accurate than any we've ever had before, because there is no line that demarcates where Tribeca ends and NoHo begins. However, this is sort of taking a sampling, or it's the wisdom of the crowd harvested in this way. And so this, I think, is an example of the synthesis that's beginning to emerge, where real semantic meaning can actually be captured when you pull together like volumes of information that kind of underlie it. So, and again, this entire little widget can be embedded, extracted. We could work with you, so you could get your own data to show up here and designate, like, kind of the different areas on this map. There could be tags that you're looking for, interested, or telling students to populate, so that those pictures show up alongside. And that's the kind of, service-oriented architecture that groups like these are just building, by nature nowadays. But I wanted to kind of try to show you something that you might not have seen before on the mapping side. Finally, coming back to just a little bit of visualization and ways that tools that never spoke to each other can talk. I do have a collection here of Nancy Freeland's film links that she's put together in Delicious, and I'm going to wander over to the site Wordle, which is going to draw us a very pretty tag cloud, and it could operate on a primary text, on any URL, but it also makes it convenient to just put in a Delicious user. And we're going to go over here, and this site, which again has nothing to do with Delicious, has now extracted, from the information you've provided to it across the internet, kind of a gloss or a summary or some kind of visualization of what existed within that Delicious account. Although it could have just as easily operated on, a paragraph or two of text, or another RSS or blog feed. So that's really what I was trying to demo and talk about today. I don't know. Yeah, we have a little bit of time for questions, and maybe I could dive into a particular tool if there's anything anyone's interested in. But is there anything that anyone else wants to ask about?